important, and we're going to respond to it. And a learning culture, that means passing on lessons learned. And throughout that, keeping it all together is engagement. If you notice, sort of the ideas up here are not just like communication or leadership. They're not concepts. It's really the behaviors that we want from people. We want people to speak up. We want people to treat each other fairly. We want people to adapt. We want people to listen and to learn. And we want people to be engaged, all of them. That means the new hires, that means mid-level employees, that means leaders. And there's an expectation that each person in the system has a responsibility, and it's a little bit different depending on where they sit and what we're expecting from them in terms of meeting those expectations. So that's the model. There's a couple of things that came along the way with that. First of all, if I didn't say this before, anybody heard of a guy named George Box? Yeah. All models are wrong, but some are useful. and I think that's very true. You know, the model is not a be-all, end-all. It's just useful, and it gives us something for a common language to have a discussion. So when the Mishap reports come in, we can talk in terms that we both understand what we're talking about. The other thing that I think is really important is where you stand now depends on where you stood later or earlier. So what your experiences have been are going to color your perceptions of how you see it. That's not necessarily a bad thing. I think everybody should focus on that actually and capitalize it, and that's why we want diversity. We want those different perspectives. That helps to build the whole picture. If we're looking at a big elephant rather than just having the tail or the trunk or the foot, we get the bigger picture. I do believe that you get what you inspect, not what you expect. And so I think the inspection processes are important. Gathering the information in terms of culture is important. I recently, however, was on an inspection. It's really kind of interesting. I don't often go on our audits. As a headquarters person, of course, you know, you got like a big bullseye and nobody really wants to talk to you anyway, you know. So I'm on an inspection. It's a 5 o'clock briefing for a flight, this is a demonstration of some aviation stuff. And I'm with the team of inspectors, and one of the inspectors shows up at the pre-brief in the hangar in flip-flops. And so, it was one of those where it was like, let's talk about modeling. And so we had a discussion about modeling behavior, and not only what that does to the team, but what that sets as the standard. As people have talked here about what can we do as regulators, first of all, mind your P's and Q's. You know, don't you be the ones violating the rules. And the other thing is that when you really want somebody to do a behavior that you're expecting, you need to demonstrate that behavior. If you expect someone to pull himself off the schedule for fatigue, then you need to have done that in front of people so they know what that looks like. So I want to go to our picture and just tell me, except you and Mike, and not David, who's just leaving, you three are exempt. In the picture of the astronaut, what's wrong with this picture? You're all smart guys and gals. We expect a lot from our astronauts, right? They're smart, they're bright, they're healthy, they're creative, they can handle pressure. Do we expect them to breathe water? That's actually not part of the protocol yet. 1.5 liters of water. I colored this so that you could sort of see. So imagine taking a fish bowl, me pouring this into it, me taking duct tape, wrapping it around your head, spinning you around at 17,500 miles an hour, and then asking you to perform while you've got water. So what happened was there was a what's called an EVA, an extravehicular activity. And I want you to see about this because even though we are trying, and how do you know when you're there? You're never there. To me, we're never there. You have lots of processes, you try, you listen, you respond, you pay attention, you're never there. How do you know when you get there? When something happens and it doesn't turn into a catastrophe. And you learn from it and you tell people about it so the next time you do. We don't know what water was really going to do in microgravity, 0G. The thought was actually that water would stick to the sides of the helmet. Well, guess what? It doesn't. It likes faces. And so, Major Parmitano is on his spacewalk. He's got water in the back of his helmet. He's 40 minutes into the spacewalk. He says, I've got water. Turns out it's migrating to the front. That's a bad thing. Now after 20 minutes of troubleshooting, control says you better go back in. That takes 40 minutes for that to happen. To get in that 40 minutes, the water has covered his ears, his eyes, his nose. He can't see, he's blind. He can't hear his comm equipment. There's water, it's not working. He ends up pulling himself back into the airlock using the safety tether, manually, blind. Almost drowns. And it takes him another 20 minutes to get his helmet off. So that was a lesson learned, right? Everybody paid attention. The head of human spaceflight said, we're going to have an investigation. It's a close call. We want to know everything that we can know about this. And we did learn from it. Unfortunately, what's the one thing you would not want to have happen with a situation like this? What would be the worst thing you could find out in the course of this investigation? It happened before. EVA 23, they were EVA 23. EVA 22, suit came back wet with a liter of water in it, and they decided not to run it to ground because it would have affected the schedule. It shook everybody up as well it should have, and you keep paying attention. And so for me, the lessons learned are we expect there's always something going on. If you don't know about it, you're out of touch. How do you know when your robust culture is working? When people are telling you stuff. That's when you know, and then when you hear about it, you react to it, you tell people about it, you celebrate it. It's not a funeral. We're going to learn from it. That's it.
Great. Okay, thanks very much for your comments, both of you. Now, I'm just going to pose a couple quick questions, and then we'll have a bit of a dialogue, and we'll throw it open to the folks in the audience for questions as well. So I'm a regulator, so I can't help but ask a question about the regulator's role in all of this. But I was interested. Garry, you said you can't legislate safety culture. Tracy, you said, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And as regulators, we, I think, try to adopt a model and implement a model. And so we've got this awkward dynamic, I think, going on between regulators and industry, where industry is probably reasonably defensive in some respects. Are these guys good enough? Do they have enough experience and insights into this? They're not walking in our shoes, so how can they apply this, quote, model to our business? So we've got that kind of awkward situation going on. So what advice would you give to regulators as we are stepping into and trying to understand how we can facilitate better monitoring, measurement, and implementation of safety culture assessments? What advice would you give to regulators?
It's a very hard one, and that's why I said I think it's very hard to legislate for safety culture. I think the regulator's job, if you're using a model like aviation, is to create need. So, this is the problem with oil and gas, that a major incident is relatively infrequent. So the guys working on there can get complacent, and regulators coming in and doing things like putting near misses as I said in my presentation, near misses as a bad thing in a chart, and that doesn't help an operator turn around and say, let's look for our near misses, let's strive to be better. It actually means that, because the other part you've got to remember is to change anything, you need a sense of urgency. So a good organisation will take that information, they will blow it out of proportion, they will turn around to their guys and say, this could have been serious. They put it all down, they send it around the organisation, and the last thing you want is a regulator coming in and going, yeah, that's a bit worrying. And that can stop that learning cycle, and that's what I try and work with a lot of the teams that I work with and a lot of the organisations, trying to overcome that. But it's the regulator's job to support people in that, I think. And the wider learning. The other area one of the roles that I do when I go into an organisation is I observe safety meetings. And I'm sitting there with a production team I've worked with for 4 years who are, their operational discipline is the best I've ever seen. And the information they're getting on safety is slip, trips and falls. And it's like, I think the regulator has a place for helping helping the industry find really good incidents that they can share, so that those guys that are at that level can look at them and go, that's a bit worrying. Because all they do is help them become complacent. So there's two things I think that can happen.
Tracy, what about your perspective?
Well, I don't believe that you can assess something if you don't know something about it. So I think that, our chief engineer has 3 things that he thinks are extremely important that he expects from all of his engineers. Of course, now I'm going to forget them, but if I can remember them, first is competency. The second is strong inline checks and balances. In other words, senior electrical engineers check electrical engineers' work. The top guys who know their stuff are the ones who are really critically assessing the more junior people. And healthy tension is the third. And I think it's critical for people who are in positions that do assessments, do inspections, do regulation, do those kinds of functions, quality assurance in the aviation world, that those people should be the people who are the most competent in those areas. If you decided to go and get your degree in counseling, in drug and alcohol counseling, there's a saying amongst the drug and alcohol counselors, because if you come in as someone who has had life experience, who has been an addict, then you get points actually in the program, and some of them as you move along, because the saying, and I'm going to try to clean this up a little bit, but you can't fool a fooler. You can't kid a kidder. To be a good drug and alcohol counselor, you need to be able to recognize when someone's high. And so I think that in terms of looking critically at people's performance, you need to know what that performance is supposed to be. What does it look like when it's good? What does it look like when it's bad? And so that gets back to sort of the credibility issues that we talked about yesterday.
So now, thinking about a company and leadership within a company, if you could, you've kind of given us this advice, I think, through your comments, but I'm wondering if you could kind of distill it down for people simply. What's your single most important piece of advice to a leader that's embarking on a safety culture assessment program and wanting to get some feedback and understand how his or her team is doing in this regard? What would you say to those people?
Well, that's a hard one because there's so much. I think for me, I work at a senior management level, but I think for me that the really important strand for culture, because management commitment is led by senior management, so they provide the resources for it. But actually, the really important strand for me is if we think about oil and gas, is that platform leadership team, because they're the ones that actually take what the senior management want and make it real to the people on the front line. And the other thing is, that it only takes one of those leadership teams not to be consistent in their leadership approach for the whole system to crumble. There's a very good example, actually. A few years ago, I was working in the North Sea, and we was doing a culture assessment. And while we was out there, one of the assistant driller actually got a warning. And the warning came from onshore, and the warning was for him cutting his hand. And he cut his hand doing a job that was going beyond what he needed to do. Basically, there was a bit of material hanging down. And his warning was for not using the right tool. And so actually, while we're out there, this is having a massive impact on the culture, to the point where we're ending up sort of discussing people how long they would be on the platform before they reported an injury to themselves. And the worst case scenario was if someone broke their finger, they would try and last 3 days. That's the conversations we're having. So we know it's having a massive impact on culture. So we're looking at this sort of this trust issue, and we go to the OAM and we said, do you think it was fair that he had a warning letter? And the OAM went, no. And I said, why do you not think it's fair? And he explained it, and it's the substitution test. If you've ever seen the reason stuff, there's a substitution test of, would I have done the same thing? And he said, I would have done the same thing, because to get the right piece of equipment, it was 4 floors down, it would have taken him 10 minutes to get there, it was a long way. I would have probably made that. So the fact that someone onshore didn't understand that and made that decision actually damaged the culture of that thing. That's not to say nothing should have happened, something should have happened. But it was the way and the belief that they went about it that undermined the trust. And it was a isolated incident, the person had a perfect record. So it's the consistency element. I think that's what leaders have to be. They have to be consistent and they have to be aligned. And it's like, not being funny, bringing up children. You know, if you've got 2 parents, and me and my wife started off like this with ours, with different approaches, it doesn't work. You know, you tell your child off, they just go to the other parent and play you against each other. As leaders, you have to be united in what you're trying to achieve and the methods you achieve it. So I think that's really important.
Tracy, what about you?
I do this all the time. You know, we're continually assessing our 10 centers. They're on a rotating basis. So every quarter, one of them is doing their assessment, and it's basically on a 3-year cycle. And so once they've finished, you know, the expectation is that we help them with the analysis and recommendations, and they spend the next 2.5 years implementing changes, and then we come back and look at them again. And the expectation is, and at this point, that's just the way we do business. So I tell them, have courage, don't take it personally. About 80% of what you're going to hear is stuff you already know. These guys are bright, they're smart, they're in meetings, hearing stuff all the time. They know what most of the issues are. Sometimes, though, there's some stuff they don't know. If they really read their comments, depending on how you know what your survey is set up like. Ours always have open dialogue boxes, so they rate, but there's always comments. You know, most of the center directors read word for word all of their thousands of comments. And there are nuggets that can be gleaned out of that. You know, the leadership's perspective pretty much across the board in the agency is that there's no difference between what we would call institutional safety and operational safety. A good safety, you know, if we're taking care of each other, we're taking care of getting the mission done. We recently had a senior leader who got injured personally, and the impact on the program was profound. And so it over time, I see it more and more. It is the same thing, and when it's done well across the board, you can tell. But I would tell them to not, you know, it's hard to sometimes see those kinds of results, and each of them get to work how they're going to respond to it, but they should address it. And they should not be afraid of bad news. Bad news never gets better with time. If there's an issue there, they need to address it. If BP knew, they had survey results, 50% of their people were telling them there was a problem. If they would have looked at those results and dug further on that, I think they could have done something more about that. And it wasn't the first time they'd seen those kinds of results. So, you know, you got to pay attention. It's important to ask the question, but once you ask the question, then you got to listen to the results and do something about it.
Thank you. Okay. we've got about 10 minutes left in our session, so I want to take some questions from the audience. Please. Okay, they're on their way. Oh, okay, we'll go there first and then here.
Okay. Tracy, I'm wondering if you can speak to how NASA addresses the safety culture of your contractors. You spoke to the kind of breadth and depth of that particular arm of the organization.
Yeah, it's really a concern. I mean, as I'm sure it is in most of your areas, the contract workforce, we include the contractors in our assessment. In fact, initially when we set it up, we had all kinds of issues about the firewall. So typically in NASA, things are all done behind the firewall for employees, but we said, no, this is going to be contractors too, and that means maybe contractors who don't even have computers, like the janitors and people like that. And so it's outside the firewall, and we do get results about the contract workforce, and we try to include them in what we do. When we do OSAs at NASA, which we do at the request of a senior leader, we'll go in. And so, like, there's a new program called Orion, and that's going to be the new capsule. And the Orion program manager made sure we included the contractors when we did the Orion OSA. And he just said, they're part of the team. I want to know what they think. Did I answer your question?
Processes, is there any kind of cultural assessment at the start before you actually select a contractor?
We try, and this is an ongoing, part of it is learning, because like most government employees aren't specialists in procurement. So learning about the contracting process for us now, the issue is to get to the cores or the procurement people so that it's written into the contract from the beginning that they will do X, Y, and Z, and many, like we have one contractor who is very proud of their safety culture legacy and history, and it's one of the things they always include when they put in their bid. But we've still got a long way to go on that.
Let's go right here.
Hi, I'm Bob Youngblood. Question is for Garry. You showed a slide with organizational learning on it. And my question is, I think it's frequently very difficult to figure out which anomalies really matter. And so keying on the word organizational, do you need an organization to do that, or can people be expected to do it ad hoc?
If I've understood your question correctly, how does the organisation learn, or is it about people's input into the learning?
Do you expect deck plate people to do it?
Yeah, you should expect deck plate.
Only deck plate people?
No, everyone, and it's a system. I mean, again, it goes back to artefacts, and I suppose the bit that we're looking for is how people on the front line report things and how that filters into continuous improvement plans, and the basic closure of that plan is the other part we're looking at. So there is an artifact trail that we look for in the learning system, essentially, that tells us whether it's taken seriously. It's quite hard to track, though, because there's so much information in good organisations that are getting people to report. And the biggest problem is, I mean, it's less so of the case now with the organisations I work with. But if I go back 3 or 4 years, it was the mandatory requirement to report certain things that filled up the system with actually quite a lot of rubbish. And then going back to people and going, because the feedback loop is so important to encourage this. So you do have to go back and you do have to say thank you very much. But yeah, you actually lose a lot of the real quality by doing that. And I'm not one of these people that thinks you tell everyone to report one thing every week. I think you encourage reporting and you reward quality. And the way you reward quality, I think we had someone say it earlier, I think it's the more ad hoc. It's saying this was really good, thank you very much. Here, have this T-shirt or hat or iPad if they're rich enough. it's the engagement element you're trying to really facilitate. But the learning part is, I suppose, how do you know that it's actually changing behaviour, and that comes as part of a good sort of review cycle of continuous sort of improvement and monitoring scheme.
I just want to pick up on that before we go to our last, probably the last question we have time for. One of the speakers this morning said it's all about engaging with people. So from an organizational learning perspective, how critical is individual competency around the ability to, kind of test your beliefs or the assumptions that might be driving your beliefs? And is that something, I've seen some things where people suggest that kind of competency inside an organization is critical for organizational learning. Just kind of curious about how you build competencies in individuals to have that level of awareness.
We do have some experience of this. We do it came out of an issue a client had. In fact, it came out of a mistake that we were partly responsible for. I put our hands up to it. We worked with a team for about 4 years actually, and our job was to make them not have a mistake on a critical piece of equipment. So we worked with them, and we used the organisational integrity method to change their attitudes towards compliance was one of the focuses. And we did, and they ended up after 2.5 years with the best procedures. They had excellent training. They understood what competence meant. They were reporting. They were thinking in a very, very good way, and had very, very positive safety culture in that team. So they were a very, very effective team. So much so that they'd become the platform that they were training the whole region on. And then we noticed when we did the climate assessment that they were complacent. They thought they were too good. And all of the work that we'd done actually had created this team that thought they couldn't have an incident. And that's why I said a bit earlier about actually, and what the company was doing was feeding them stuff that they were very unlikely to do. And saying this is an incident. So that was just reinforcing it. So then we went back and we designed a training program which is called Human Factors Awareness of Frontline Roles. And the first hour and a half of that is proving that they're going to make mistakes. It's all about human limitations. It's all about how you perceive information, how you make decisions, and the weaknesses with human beings. So it's pulling them back down to the grassroots. And then it was training them on error analysis and how people make mistakes. And so that's how we kind of tried to deal with that with them. And it really did increase their understanding of risk of people and each other.
I'll make a quick comment and we'll go to the last question then.
For us, technical competency is usually not the issue, but emotional competency is something different. So, in other words, people's ability to relate, to communicate, to maintain eye contact, things like that. Remember, it's an engineering organization, and of course, as a psychologist, it's a lot of fun to joke around with the engineers. I try not to do it too much, but sometimes I just can't help it. When I first came to NASA, one of my buddies said, well, you know the difference between the introverted engineer and the extroverted engineer. And I went, no. And he said, well, you can tell when you're standing there talking to him, the extroverted engineer is the one who's looking at your shoes. Okay, thank you. I'll remember that. And that has actually happened. And so I think that, sometimes, and I can only speak at this point really for the workforce that I am most familiar with. And in that workforce, people are highly technically trained, and they get continuous technical training. It's rigorous. But what they're not necessarily good at, some of them are, but not everyone, what we work on is their communication. And that's different, because all of that knowledge in the world isn't going to make any difference if they can't share it.
So I want to give our keynote speaker from yesterday the last question, but we're going to have to be really quick because I think we're out of time. So can you make a very short question and we'll have very short answers.
I risk opening a can of worms. These are excellent examples which to me are much more about changing behaviors than they are about changing cultures. Cultures are bigger things. The behaviors are an expression of culture, but a culture is a bigger thing, and the anthropologists will tell you that cultures don't change, they adapt. and it's an incremental process, and it is in response to stimuli. They will respond to things, they'll take advantage of something that's useful. Think of our people in northern Canada. They used to have dog sleds, now they have snowmobiles, right? That's a cultural shift, okay? Or it might be, fear will drive this, it will response to a crisis and things like that. What are the real triggers then that, in your experience, have actually changed cultures? How do you change cultures? What are the real drivers for changing cultures in your experience?
So we'll let each of you take a crack at that in 2 sentences.
Okay, I actually did a whole presentation 2 weeks ago on this at the Energy Institute in Aberdeen, and it was how to change cultures in the technical workforce. And I think the first part of that is that you change cultures for the workforce that you're working in. And the approach we took with them, and it was around compliance, was we used involving them in developing better procedures. We did safety critical task analysis with them included to train them covertly about human factors. We got them to test them. So the whole approach meant they ended up with a procedure at the end that they'd written, that they believed in, that was accurate, that was accessible, and then we went, go and use it. And they went, of course I'm going to use it, it's mine. And that's what we were changing with them. We were changing that belief that a procedure wasn't useful and wasn't going to help them to a belief that actually it could help save someone's life. And we did it covertly. We never told them we were going to change their compliance, their attitude towards compliance.
So when we set up the safety culture program, we did 5 things that were sort of must-do things, because it's my belief that we aren't going to change the culture, but I do believe we can influence the culture. And I think, so the first thing is no one gets off the hook. Everybody has a responsibility. Everyone's in the system, and if they're in the system, they have some sort of responsibility. Leader, manager, the employee, contractor, or whatever. And so that involves then, there's an assessment process everybody participates in. There's an educational process everybody participates in. That's formal training, because just assessing culture doesn't change it. There's a third part that's engagement, and that's where there's more in-depth kind of involvement with people. There's a fourth part that's about guidance. If you don't change the actual requirements, then, if I get struck by lightning, I don't want them back at ground zero. So at least in NASA, which is a very procedurally driven organization, it has to be written into the NPRs and NPDs. And the last is the artifacts. All the little media things, the posters, the pins, I see artifacts all the time of previous generations, Apollo, Gemini, of the different eras that have come before us, and we're working to embed different artifacts that will encourage people to adapt their behavior in the way that we're hoping they will.
Great. Well, join me in giving these folks the acknowledgement that's due to them, please, for great presentations.